Let's talk about the other small topic you decided to take on, free will. And you come down on the side that there is.
Yeah, I figured I had, I mean, you know, there's reams written on this topic in itself, and it's hugely contentious and furiously argued. But I felt I had to say something about it because it is such a central aspect of what our minds experience. Yeah. And I also thought that, you know, I also wanted to ask within the sort of framing device of my book, well, can we imagine a mind that doesn't have free will, that has experience as we do, but that is just somehow watching itself do stuff, you know, without any volition? I find it very hard to imagine a mind like that. And I think the reason I do is that it goes against what minds are for. What would be the purpose of a mind like that, rather than just having an insensate sort of machine-like device that is just responding to, you know, to what happens? But there are some of the people, at least, well, in fact, it's hard to get away from the idea that if you don't believe in free will, actually that is all we are. We are just, you know, pushed around, and we're just imagining that we're actually, you know, having any effect on it. But actually, we are just these machines being pushed around by atoms, you know, and being dictated to by the conditions of the Big Bang. That, you know, everything unfolded inevitably from that. And there are people who argue that. The position I take in the book is that for me to believe I have free will, all I would ask is that I be, in some meaningful sense, the cause of things that happen, to me, or some of the things that happen to me. So to my mind, it comes down, free will comes down to this idea of causation. Where is causation in the world? If causation just flows up from atoms colliding, it is very hard to see how free will fits into that. And, you know, people who argue for that position say, well, you know, what else is there apart from forces between atoms? Where can the free will come in to actually move atoms around? And I guess my answer to that would be just like this. This is free will, if you like, or in my mind, moving atoms. Is actually very simple. And if you say, well, okay, but let's break that down. It's your neurons firing, and those neurons are firing because there are ions going through the you know, the cell walls, through proteins. You know, that's all it is. But there are very good reasons, not just hand-waving reasons, but actually technical reasons. When you start to, there are ways to quantify causation in a complex system, to measure how much causation resides at the different levels of the system. And if you do that for complex systems like the brain, then it seems to indicate quite clearly that there is more causation happening at the higher levels of the system. That you have to say, you know, at the level of individual neurons, there is no causal power that is causing this glass to move. It's only at the higher level of my, you know, sort of neural modules, really, at that level of my decision-making neural apparatus. That's where causation is primarily coming from. So that's all I'm asking for.
Even scientific theories, I mean, the law of natural selection isn't there in physics. There was no law of natural selection when the universe began because there was nothing to select amongst.
Well, that's true, although it's a really interesting discussion, you know, whether there is something about the nature of matter, or actually perhaps even more fundamentally the nature of information, that makes something like natural selection kind of inevitable when matter gets complex enough. And you know, I think it's a completely open question, but I think it's not one that is outside of science to begin to examine whether something like natural selection was inevitable once you have matter that has certain properties, once you have, you know, molecules that start to, and in fact, you know, one thing I ask at the end of the book is whether mindedness might actually be a sort of an inevitable property of the universe. Because I think we're not astonished enough, and not astonished often enough, at this very weird thing that has happened in the universe, that it's become aware of itself. You know, that sounds like a very kind of poetic, flowery thing to say, but actually it's simply the truth. Yeah. That a bit of the universe here and there has become aware of itself, you know, in some sense, to some degree. Was that inevitable? Where did that capacity come from? One of the questions I do try to pose, at least in this book, is whether we can start to make headway in thinking about that, and thinking about whether there's some fundamental property of how information is organized in the universe that makes minds inevitable, in the same way as general relativity makes black holes inevitable.
Yeah, well, that's one of the very nice things about the book, is that in a way what you do is you pose better questions rather than trying to give us answers. In other words, I can't think of anywhere in the book where you say, well, there's the answer. What you do is say, look, here's some badly put questions from the past. Let's unpack them a bit and see if we can put them in a much more interesting way. And that's one of the nice things about the book, and particularly where you end up, because in a way you sort of end up thinking about, well, are the electrons, are the fundamental particles, are they what creates your thoughts? In some sense they are, but can the thoughts push the electrons around as well, which is what you're saying somehow?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it sounds kind of weird. It sounds mystical, doesn't it? Put like that, as though there's some weird psychic force that is moving matter. But actually, all I'm saying is that causal power accumulates. Evolution, actually, you know, that's one of the things it does. Actually, it spreads causal power up to higher levels of the system, and there are ways that you can quantify that. There's nothing mystical about that. It's perfectly straightforward, and that's what biological agency, to my mind, is all about. That it's an accumulation of causal power at higher levels of the system, simply using, you know, nothing mystical, simply using all the forces and particles that we know about. But, you know, sort of relocating where cause is coming from, that as complexity deepens and as evolution proceeds, that is what we see happening. So yeah, that's certainly something I'm trying to suggest. I mean, David, I'm very glad that you saw the book that way, as trying to find better questions. I think already there's a little indication that, you know, some people might be a bit disappointed by that, because we're used to these books that promise that they're going to tell you how the mind works, and you're not going to get that from this book.
As if you could find the answer to life, universe, and everything for $8.99 in Waterstones. It's just not going to happen.
I don't think so. And certainly not in this book. But that's exactly what I want to do. I want to try to pose better questions, and to provide a framework for thinking about these things that we absolutely don't have the answer to yet. I think we would be shortchanging ourselves to pretend that, you know, we have the answers to these things. But I think, you know, that's obviously often how progress is made in science anyway. It's not by doing some experiment to find a better answer, but actually finding a better way to formulate the question.
Do you expect pushback from some parts of science? Because although you come across very reasonably in the book, you're sort of open about what you're talking about and where your assumptions are. You do take a lot of positions, and your overall argument is one which would horrify a whole group of scientists. Do you expect pushback? Have you had any from them?
There may be. I mean, certainly in talking about free will, you're going to upset someone inevitably. But I guess I feel there. To be frank, I felt it's these arguments about determinism of fundamental particles, trying to talk about free will in terms of what fundamental particles do. It's really a dead end. It's really time to leave that behind. That kind of, you know, it goes back to Simon Laplace in the 18th century, that if we knew where all the particles are, we can predict the future. We've moved on from that. Actually, the interesting questions to ask there are about the neurobiology of volition. That's what I'm saying. That it's, you know, let's actually pose some questions that are meaningful in that sphere, which is about how does volition work? How does our decision making work? So there may be some pushback there, but I think elsewhere, what I've really tried to do, I mean, you know, I have a chapter on consciousness, but what I've really tried to do is to give a sense of the ways people are thinking about consciousness and not to take a view. I don't think I couldn't take a view. You know, as far as I can see at the moment, we simply don't have the data, the experiments to distinguish between different views of consciousness. But I think a lot of the theories that have been put forward are interesting, and they, you know, provide a window on that question. So let's be pluralist at this point until we have, you know, until the data is in. And I think, you know, I would hope in terms of what I say about, I mean, you know, another controversial possibly area is where I talk about plant neurobiology and biopsychism. So there are serious scientists now who argue that plants have something like sentience. Even some argue they might experience something like pain.
So it's like something to be a dandelion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably not like very much, but it's like something. It's not the same. Being dandelion is not the same as being a stone. And to that degree, I think that's true, actually. I think that living things are, you know, there's something qualitatively different about them. Whether that qualitative difference requires you to invoke some kind of mind for everything that is alive, that's basically the biopsychist position, I'm agnostic about, but I think it's an interesting question to ask if it means that you can start to formulate, you know, hypotheses, testable questions about that. And I think for that reason, I welcome plant neurobiology and biopsychism, you know, if it's a productive way of thinking about things, even if we end up thinking, well, actually, it doesn't mean very much to say that bacterium has a mind. What it does, what I think it is meaningful to say is that life itself is probably best seen as a cognitive process. So leaving aside questions of sentience, thinking about it as a cognitive process rather than as a machine-like process, I think is a far more fertile way to talk about biology in general.
Yes, but I mean, you say you know, you're quite open and about looking at different things, but you do take two very strong views, which is one, there is consciousness, the idea that consciousness is just is an illusion, and you think free will is not an illusion either. Do you think we've left behind that worldview? Because it's not that long ago where you couldn't say either of those two things without being told that you were just some rampantly anti-scientific hippie. Do you think we've left that behind now? And if we have, it's happened quite quickly.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, we've also left behind the idea that if you believed in panpsychism, in there being a bit of consciousness in everything, that you're a hippie. I mean, it's not a mainstream view, but it's coming back into philosophy, which is quite interesting. I don't think I don't take that view myself, but you know, one is allowed to say it. I think with free will, I guess I really hope, as I say, that it just gets moved on to a more productive discussion with, you know, about neurobiology. With consciousness, I guess I feel I'm very much with the philosopher Galen Strawson here. I think it was Galen who said, you know, that to say free will is an illusion, it's hard to know where you even start. It's like, you know, it's like saying, I mean, it is like saying actually solidity is an illusion, and I say I refute it thus. Because come on, I mean, it's, you know, people used to say that, right? They used to say, well, it's not because it's mostly empty space, but no, it's not. It's, you know, it's one of these emergent properties. And I think to say consciousness is, it's almost as though you have to, it's a bit like free will, actually. You almost have to redefine it as something other than what it self-evidently is, what it means, in order to say it's an illusion. You know, it's here. It's what we experience. That is consciousness. Now, that is what we're meant to explain. If you want to make it into something that you can kind of, you know, explain away and say, well, you know, it's not real. Somehow we're an automaton. I don't quite know where you even go with that, because if what you're saying contradicts experience, what have we got left? So I guess I feel, and I think that's, you know, I don't think that's really controversial in neuroscience now. I think most neuroscientists are wanting to explain consciousness and to understand it, but not to explain it away, and not to, not to deny it.
We've got a question come in, if you don't mind. Stella O'Brien says, Is there any topic that intrigues you, but for which you couldn't find a better question? Brackets, shall you mull this over for a follow-up book too?
Intrigued me, but for which I couldn't find a better question. I mean, that I probably will need to mull that over. I mean, one thing, okay, there's probably a nagging thought in the back of my mind that is true of consciousness. I certainly think, as I say, that's true of free will, that actually there are better questions to ask, which are about decision making and volition. And part of me does wonder whether actually the way consciousness, the arguments about consciousness will be resolved is that we'll think, oh crikey, we should have been asking this, rather than that we'll find an answer to what is consciousness. The question will be relocated. That often happens. I think that's probably going to happen in quantum mechanics for what it's worth as well. So maybe that's one of them. Maybe we're still waiting for the better question about consciousness.
I mean, it does boil down to whether you're willing to have emergence. It's one of those words, isn't it? 20 years ago, emergence, you were told to leave the room and go and wash your mouth out. And now you're allowed to. And in some ways, the anti-emergence seems less scientific. The notion that if I asked you, Philip, what's 2 and 2? What's the answer to 2 and 2? You're going to say 4. I think it's because you had an idea worked out from the rules of mathematics. And it seems so unparsimonious to say, well, actually, some quarks and electrons headed out from the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, and they were always destined to collide with each other to make you say the words 4. That just seems so unlikely.
What it really means, I mean, I talk about this in the book as well. If you pursue that line, your explanation for everything that happens is simply, it has to be, you cannot avoid it, it has to be simply a description of everything that has happened since the Big Bang. That is the nature of and so in the end, all you're saying, if you take that, hard determinist position that it's all particles, all you end up saying is that everything that happened. And if it happened again, it would happen again. It takes a bit of unpacking, but really that's where you end up with. That's all that you can say. And to my mind, that is so empty. I mean, it's not an explanation, is it? It's just a description.
Isn't it the scientific version of it's like God moves in mysterious ways. It's just saying the universe moves in mysterious ways. Like you say, what kind of explanation is that?
Yeah, or even, not even in mysterious ways, but just you just saying the universe is. It just did what it did. That's what happened. So actually, if you take that view, there is nothing you can obviously exclude from your explanation, between the event and the Big Bang. Yes. Nothing. Including every quantum mechanical fluctuation that happened, because those were crucial at the beginning of the Big Bang. What came out of it was contingent on those. So it becomes, that if you take that idea seriously, that's really my problem. That the hard determinists don't take their own view seriously enough. If they took it seriously enough, that's what they would end up as, and that's what they'd end up with, and that it is no explanation at all.
We've run out of time, but just what's the next book, Philip? Go on, tell us what it is.
Okay, the next book
in a few seconds. Tell us.
It's equally absurd. It's going to be at least this size, I'm afraid. It's about how I'm embarrassed even to say it. It's about how life works. It's trying to move on the narratives that we have about biology to ones that actually reflect what we have learned over the past 2 or 3 decades about how life really works. Fabulous. I look forward to interviewing you about it. Hurry up and get it printed. Philip, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thanks, David. Pleasure. Bye-bye. Bye.